Well, welcome everyone to today's session. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to introduce you our presenters today. Anita Stel, who is a tutor at the School of Languages and Cultures in the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia. She teaches both undergraduate and postgraduate students in the Applied Linguistics program. Her research interests are in second language acquisition and assessment for children and adults, but more specifically, she focuses on collaborative and individual writing processes and performances. Our next presenter is Megan Newsell, who works also at the University of Queensland's Institute of Continuing and TESOL Education, where she holds the position of senior teacher, ELI COS curriculum. She's also a tutor at the University School of Languages and Cultures, teaching postgraduate students in the Applied Linguistics program. She has special interest and expertise in IELTS, English for specific and academic purposes, and materials development. She's the co-author of several English language teaching textbooks and online courses, and she has also published and presented extensively in the areas of action research and English language assessment. And our third presenter, Noriko Wishita, is an associate professor at the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Queensland. She teaches classroom SLA, language pedagogy courses, language assessment and testing in master's program, and supervises PhD and master's students in the area of assessment and classroom SLA. Her research interests include peer interaction in classroom-based research and classroom assessment, the interfaces of language assessment and SLA, and task-based teaching and assessment. Her work has been published in a co-authored book, edited book, and flagship journals such as Studies in Second Language Acquisition, Language Learning, Applied Linguistics, Language Teaching Research, and Language Testing. Thank you again, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenters. Please type your questions in the chat box, which I'll be monitoring, and we'll open it for questions in the end.
Thanks, everyone. Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation today. So as mentioned before, my name's Anita and this is Megan, and we're going to be presenting on behalf of our team part of our research, which focuses on understanding the impact of IELTS for assessing communicative skills through the perceptions of both the Japanese students and teachers. So our project was recently published through the IELTS Joint Funded Research Program. It's been a very memorable project, and we just like to thank IELTS for their generous support, and also for the teachers and students who participated in different stages of our project as well. So this will be the outline for our presentation today. We're just going to be focusing on 2 of our 5 research questions. The questions that really help us to understand the potential impact that IELTS could have for assessing communicative skills in a Japanese context. So Megan and I will be presenting different parts, and so you'll be hearing from both of us throughout the presentation. So I'm just going to be starting by introducing the background for our study. So before this project started, there was a lot of concerns with the low level of proficiency of Japanese EFL students, and especially with the need for cross-cultural communication. So there are a few examples just from starting in 2019 when Japan was preparing and hosting the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics, and later on with the global pandemic, the need to engage in more virtual communication and having online lessons as well. So because of this, MEXT, the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, they were aware of the need for English, and they proposed a few initiatives to enhance a more balanced English language proficiency across the 4 skills. And one of the initiatives was to introduce commercial tests as an alternative to the common exam. So this currently is on hold till further notice. But as you can see here, IELTS is an example of one of these commercial tests. And a lot of the different universities in Japan are starting to accept IELTS as one of the entrance exam scores. So for our study, we were interested in understanding more about the perceptions of the stakeholders, so the English teachers and the students in Japan, about what they thought of using IELTS as an alternative in Japan, right, for the entrance exam. As we know, IELTS is one of the most popular English proficiency tests, right? And in order to maintain that high standard over all these years, IELTS does continue to conduct research on the test validity and reliability. And as Megan will elaborate further, as she talks more about the literature review, less is currently known about the impact of IELTS for communicative skills in contexts like Japan at the moment. So I'll let Megan continue on with the literature.
Thank you, Anita. So as Anita said, our study focused on the perceptions and attitudes that Japanese students and teachers have towards the IELTS writing and speaking tests in particular, and the effects that those tests may have on their academic achievement and their academic communication skills. So as a consequence, our literature review focused on test validity, so the evaluation of the test's appropriateness in terms of what it's measuring and how those scores can be interpreted, and also the social consequences of the test's use. So in addition to that consequential aspect of test validity, we also focused on predictive validity. So I'll just take you through some of the things that we found in our literature review. We wanted to really focus on views of stakeholders, because we think that their views are so important in really giving us a broader view of the impact that IELTS can have on students' L2 communication and their future academic studies. So we know that in many parts of the world, English-speaking medium universities may use an IELTS score as an entry requirement for higher education. And so in terms of the validation aspect, there is already a test of English for academic purposes, the TEEP, which is a 4-skill academic English language proficiency test. We found that Green's study was a really useful one for us to look at, because there was quite a lot of data about perceptions of that test. And for example, reading skills traditionally are highly valued and focused upon in teaching at upper secondary school level, and that's due to the washback of the current centre exam, which focuses on that skill. So really, when Green did this study, the findings were that teachers were quite positive about this MEXT initiative to reform university entrance examinations to broaden out the requirement to 4 skills, and saw this as having a potentially positive impact on current practice. So we were interested to see whether or not IELTS, whether our participants would also have similar views about introducing IELTS as an exam. So looking at another study from Sawaki as well, that was also useful in that it talked about university lecturers' views on use of L1 and L2 at university level, and how language is used in those content courses, and their perceptions on the importance of using 4 skills, and how important a test is to assess students' abilities prior to entering university. So just moving on, there are a number of predictive validity studies out there. We looked at some that showed that there, although there is perhaps a correlation between certain aspects of academic achievement and IELTS scores, there are so many other factors which affect a student's academic achievement. So IELTS has been found to provide a good indication of students' ability to use the target language in an academic setting. But we do always have to remember that there are other factors which affect students' success when they get to university. But there are some correlations. And writing and speaking are really commonly used to measure students' communicative abilities. So their ability to communicate outside the classroom in a real world context. And there are, of course, a number of studies that we looked at which focus on the impact of IELTS and looking at things like the impact of IELTS preparation courses and looking at the use of teaching materials for IELTS, looking at the washback as well of those of the test on those practices in terms of learning and teaching. And those were some of the studies that we featured there in our literature review. If we look at the summary there, basically that led us to say that, you know, considering the importance of both speaking and writing in academic settings and the teaching of English language skills in an EFL setting in Japan, it was really important to collect stakeholder views to get that broader view of the impact that IELTS can have both on students' academic studies and their L2 communication skills. Thanks, Anita. So looking at our research questions, we actually had 5, but when we, for today's presentation, we decided to focus mainly on questions 4 and 5. So looking at the extent to which, as I've just foreshadowed with the literature review, teachers and students view IELTS speaking and writing as an appropriate measure for assessing communication. Are those tests an appropriate way to do that? And looking at their views on the suitability of IELTS as an alternative to the current nationwide centre exam. Thanks, Anita. So moving on to methodology, I'll just quickly tell you about our study and what we did. So we began originally with a little pilot that we carried out in Brisbane with some teachers. And then we expanded out from that initial pilot phase to approaching about 53 teachers and 44 students across these different centres in Japan. And we collected data from those participants. And in terms of the design of our study, it was an exploratory mixed method design. So in terms of our quantitative data, we had questionnaire survey data and carried out statistical analysis on that data from the survey. And then, of course, we also had follow-up interviews as well. So here's an example of our questionnaire. And as you can see, of course, administered in Japanese so that we weren't having to worry about language barriers. And you can see some of that demographic data that we collected in that slide there from our questionnaire. Following the questionnaire, we also went on and we asked the students some more detailed follow-up questions. For example, some students we found perhaps weren't very, or some participants I should say, weren't very familiar with IELTS. So it was really important to find out, you know, whether they'd taken the test, whether they knew much about the test in terms of interpreting their answers. And you can see here also, of course, our research questions really wanted to know whether people felt this was an appropriate test for assessing communication skills in terms of writing and speaking. So we actually were able to show them some tasks, some sample tasks, and ask the participants, well, what do you think about this task? Do you think it's appropriate? And do you think it's doable as well? So we got some really interesting insights from the participants about their views on the tasks. As I mentioned, we followed up the surveys with some semi-structured interviews, And we used, of course, a form here. You can see these are some of the questions that we asked the participants. And as I also mentioned, questionnaires were analysed to give us some quantitative data, and interviews, the qualitative data from those was analysed, and we carried out a thematic analysis and identified some strong themes that came out of those interviews. Thanks, Anita. Moving on now to the findings.
Thanks, Megan. So now I'm just going to be talking about research question 4 first. So research question 4, we were really looking at 2 different aspects of communication. So we had questions related to general communication and also academic communication skills as well. So here are the 2 questions, and we also separated them according to the different test types as well. So question 26 was focusing on the speaking test, whereas 34 was on the writing test. And just from looking at the results for these 2 questions, we noticed that the results were quite similar for both groups. So the teachers and the students had similar views on what they thought about the speaking test. So as you can see here, quite a lot of the students, the respondents, they did agree that the speaking test was good for general communication skills. So after the test, they would be able to communicate with people outside. And a similar sort of thing happened with the writing test as well, where the majority of them agreed that it was good for general communication skills. But when we had a look at the test, when we focused on academic communication skills, there were slight differences. So they did have similar views with the speaking test. So majority of them did agree that the test was useful for academic skills. But when it came to the writing test, quite a lot of them believed that it wasn't as useful. As you can see here, the average did shift a lot more. So on average, the students and the teachers gave 2.5. So it was around about a not useful to neutral area, as you can see in this figure. And another thing to point out would be that quite a few of the teachers also didn't respond to this question. And we found that quite interesting as well. So 6 of them didn't respond, which gave us an indication that they of their thoughts there as well. When we were looking at the open-ended items, as Megan mentioned before, and the interview data, they did give us further indication of what they thought about both the speaking and the writing tests. So here with the speaking test, the teachers, they did mention how it is quite practical for students on a daily basis, so they're able to communicate in English. But there were quite a few who weren't really sure whether the interview style format would be considered natural and comfortable for the students. So they did mention a couple of concerns there, and this was an example of one where they weren't quite sure if it could be called communication or not. As for the writing test, so again, there were quite different views on the writing, especially for developing academic skills, where they did agree that it would help to a certain degree, but there were areas, they focused on different areas, which were quite interesting. The teachers focused a lot on cohesion and coherence, so the ability to, like this example here, to compose sentences logically, and a lot of them talked about the overall, the flow of the students' writing, whereas a lot more of the students focused more on words. So they focused on the need for vocabulary and being able to express themselves in an appropriate sort of way. And we noticed that in both the open-ended questions and the interviews as well. For the last research question, so for the last research question, we were looking to see whether the stakeholders thought that it was suitable as a alternative test to the current central exam. So we had two questions. The first one here, question 38, we're looking to see whether it was a good alternative. And question 40, we're looking more to seeing whether teachers and students would like to introduce more writing and speaking items into the English test instead. And the results are quite different. So for question 38, a lot of the teachers and students disagreed. They felt that the test, it wasn't quite fair. Many of them talked about how IELTS needed more extensive knowledge and additional academic skills, so it wouldn't be appropriate for students at this stage. But for question 40, they were open to the idea of including additional questions to their current test. And they talked a lot about the different benefits of having the additional tasks as well. Through looking at the open-ended questions, open-ended responses and the interviews, we noticed there were a few additional reasons. So the first one was to do with the misalignment with IELTS with the curriculum. And this was where they talked more about how, like the student here talked about how it was unfair for students who hadn't experienced IELTS before, and they were also concerned with the teachers, whether they had enough support and they had the resources to teach the students and help them prepare. A few other teachers also talked about there were different barriers. They mentioned a lot about class sizes, the need to change parts of the curriculum, the amount of time it would take, a lot of the resources. So during the interviews, they did give a lot more, I guess, in that sense, where they're acknowledging the hurdles, but there were quite a few who also talked about the benefits. So after overcoming these hurdles, they could see how it would help improve the students' overall ability as well. So the last part was to do with equity. A few students and the teachers also talked about how they were concerned with the costs, the amount of time it would take, the extra tuition, and the future plans to study abroad as well, and whether it was fair for the majority of students to take this test as well. So just to do a quick summary before Megan talks a bit more about washback and the impact of IELTS. So for the first research question we talked about, you could see that IELTS, the stakeholders did believe that it was a good measure of general communication, but not everyone agreed that the writing test was suitable for them, especially to develop academic communication skills. And for research question 5, there were a few interesting points there where they didn't believe that it would fit with the current curriculum. A lot of changes would need to be made. There would be pressure for the teachers and students, and there would be also equity issues as well. But overall, they still did have a positive look on some of the test items that if it was included in a new exam for them. So I'll just move it on to Megan to talk more about washback and impact.
Thanks, Anita. And I can see that question there saying, was there anything that really surprised us from those findings? And yes, that equity issue was surprising for me, that people spoke about feeling concerned about whether all students would have access to the test, and talking about things like expense and travel to be able to take the test. So we thought that was a really interesting finding. And just a quick word on washback and impact, which relate to research questions 4 and 5. From the study, we could see that there was definitely potential for positive impact introducing IELTS as a university entrance test, as being that really potential catalyst for positive curriculum change, and really having a significant influence on teaching and learning in Japan, particularly in the high school level. But we think about the learning priorities of the students and what perhaps they would want to focus more on. There would certainly be probably a change in the skills that are emphasised, so less emphasis on reading, for example. And then we do want to also just give a note of caution in that these high stakes tests, as we all know, have really profound washback effects. And so what could happen is that teachers and learners, because they're really wanting to prepare for these tests, might actually neglect the communicative aspect of them in perhaps trying to, as we know, sometimes we see people memorizing responses in order to do well in a particular type of writing or speaking test. So the testing situation gets emphasized rather than the skill. And so that introduction of IELTS may not result in the desired changes in educational practices and the desired improvements in writing and speaking for Japanese English language learners. So just a couple of points we wanted to bring up there in our discussion. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you. So that was the end of our presentation. If you want to know more about our project, here's the contact details and also a QR code to our paper if you'd like to read more as well. Thank you.
Thank you to all the presenters. What an interesting and wonderful study. I mean, fascinating. And thank you for your work. I was particularly interested in following it up, and you got some really interesting findings there. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat here. If our audience has any questions, please type them here. And in the meantime, I'm just going to ask a question. I was particularly interested in, correct me if I missed it, or but for the writing, which writing did you show to your participants?
Academic, yeah, academic. So
both
academic
parts. Was it
both parts? Yeah, both parts.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so the findings were that they thought it was good for academic purposes, but not for communicative purposes.
Yeah, that was quite a strong finding, I think. Yeah, that and there was some anxiety from students about whether they would have enough to write about, whether they would be able to write about these academic topics. You know, that was something they'd probably need to spend extra time working on preparing for. Anita, did you have anything else to add there?
It was also to do with how they interpreted academic as well. So a lot of them focused on, like Megan said, it was mainly to do with their opinions. They felt like these writing tests wouldn't actually help them develop those areas enough, or there were gaps there that they needed to fill in first. So I guess for them, they felt it wasn't a learning opportunity. They saw more gaps than actual areas that would help them improve, sort of thing. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. There is a question from Joanna, which I've also pasted in the chat. She says, thanks for your presentation. Do you think adding a speaking only test to the test center would be a good reform action?
Thanks, Joanna. So I'll start, and I would say yes. So I think this is what we certainly found, was that that there's just been less attention paid to developing speaking skills traditionally because of the entrance exams that are in place. So my feeling would be yes, that would be a really positive introduction in terms of washback. What about you, Anita?
No, I agree. It'd be less overwhelming. So for the students, they thought having just the IELTS test was a bit too much for them, but slowly introducing like a speaking component, it would just kind of move them in that direction, I guess, that the MEXT is trying to push them towards or encourage.
Thank you. I'm going to go very quickly because we have a few other questions. From Duane Tran, many thanks for your presentation. I think similar practices are carried out here in Vietnam when IELTS scores are used instead of university entrance exam results. Do you, as the researchers of this study, think that it is a good idea to use IELTS scores for university entrance purposes?
So certainly, yes, I do believe that you need some way of measuring students' abilities and some form of reliable, valid test to assess whether students can enter universities, and do that in a fairly efficient way. Logistically, it's easier rather than universities having to develop their own assessments for that purpose. So yes, it's practical. I think, though, that of course what does tend to happen is that the focus becomes quite overt on the exam rather than on the skills that you're going to need to use at university afterwards.
Thank you. Just very quick final question from Kyle Smith. Thanks for the presentation. In response to your findings, what specific curriculum changes do you think could be implemented? Just a very quick answer.
Teachers were very positive. The Japanese high school teachers that we spoke to were very positive about the possibility of making positive curriculum changes with a greater emphasis on writing and speaking. So they were very open to receiving assistance with that in terms of training or materials. I believe that IELTS is actually working towards that in Japan, offering Japanese teachers more support in terms of curricular resources.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I'd like to invite our participants and the audience to join the discussion in the community space, and also please complete the survey, which will help us a lot, including the presenters. Thank you so much for your research and this wonderful study, and we'll be seeing you at these other presentations. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye.
guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.